The river was running high the night Benjamin Reed rode in with blood on his collar and desperation carved into every line of his face, and Georgia Slater was already standing at the edge of her dock with a lantern in one hand and a Winchester rifle in the other. She had not been waiting for him specifically. She had never met the man before in her life. But she had been expecting something like him, some fool racing toward the Rio Grande border with the law on his heels or the devil at his back, demanding passage across the water at an hour when no sane ferryman made the crossing. She had turned back 3 men already that week. 2 of them had been outlaws with wanted posters that matched their crooked faces. One had been a Texas Ranger who tried to bully her into ferrying him south without paying the crossing toll. She had pressed the barrel of her Winchester against that Ranger's nose and told him to come back in daylight with correct coin and a better attitude. He had gone. So when Benjamin Reed came thundering down the rocky slope toward her dock on a bay horse that was lathered white and nearly broken, Georgia Slater lifted her lantern and her rifle together, and she called out into the darkness with a voice that carried over the rushing water like a bell. "Whoever you are, you stop that horse 20 feet from my dock, and you state your name and your business before you take another step." The rider hauled back on the reins. The horse skidded on loose gravel and nearly went to its knees, and the man atop it swung down before the animal had fully stopped. He was taller than she'd expected, with broad shoulders under a trail-dusted coat and a Colt Peacemaker on each hip. The lantern light caught the dark stain at his collar first, and then his face. He was perhaps 30, with jaw stubble and gray eyes that were doing something she rarely saw in men who came to her dock in the dark. They were calculating, taking her measure with the same seriousness she was giving him. "Benjamin Reed," he said. His voice was steady, which told her he was either very controlled or very practiced at being afraid. "Former deputy marshal out of Laredo. I need passage south of the border tonight. I can pay." "Every man who comes to my dock in the middle of the night says he can pay," Georgia said. She had not lowered the rifle. "What I need to know, Benjamin Reed, is whether you've got someone chasing you who's going to arrive at my dock in 10 minutes and shoot holes through my flatboat." There was a pause. The river churned behind her, black and loud. Somewhere in the mesquite thicket on the eastern bank, a coyote called once and went quiet, and the silence after it felt like a held breath. "Yes," he said. Georgia lowered the rifle to her hip, not all the way down, but enough to indicate she was listening. "Then you'd better start talking fast," she said, "because I don't run a charity, I don't run a hiding operation, and I especially don't run a service for men who bring their trouble onto my property without a full explanation." He started talking. 3 weeks earlier, Benjamin Reed had been the most reliable deputy marshal in the Laredo district, which in 1883 was a distinction that meant very little in terms of comfort and a great deal in terms of danger. The Texas border country along the Rio Grande was a landscape of competing authorities: U.S. Marshals, Texas Rangers, Mexican rurals, cattle barons, smuggling rings, and the occasional Apache raiding party that had not yet been pushed entirely south by the relentless encroachment of railroads and settlement. Benjamin had navigated all of these competing interests for 7 years with a combination of hard-earned skill and the kind of stubborn moral clarity that made him useful to honest men and inconvenient to everyone else. The trouble had started with a man named Doran Holt. Doran Holt was the kind of man that frontier justice produced occasionally, like a bad season produces local weed, abundant, toxic, and very difficult to remove once established. He ran a smuggling operation that moved stolen cattle and dry goods south across the Rio Grande in exchange for Mexican silver, and he had been doing it so effectively for so long that half the merchants in Laredo and 3 of the 4 county commissioners had quietly stopped looking at what he was doing. The one county commissioner who had not stopped looking was a man named Aldridge Polk, and 2 months ago Aldridge Polk had turned up dead in an arroyo outside of town with 3 bullets in him, and a look of considerable surprise on his face. Benjamin had been assigned to investigate the killing. He had spent 4 weeks on it, riding the border country, talking to vaqueros and drovers and cantina owners on both sides of the river, and what he had found was worse than he'd expected. Doran Holt hadn't just ordered Polk's murder. Holt had done it himself, and there were 2 witnesses who had seen it from the roof of a warehouse where they'd been hiding from entirely unrelated trouble of their own. Getting those witnesses to testify had taken 2 more weeks, and a promise of protection that Benjamin was prepared to spend the rest of his career delivering. What he had not anticipated was that his own marshal, a man named Clarence Vane, was Doran Holt's brother-in-law by a second marriage and had been on Holt's payroll for 4 years. Benjamin had found that out 11 days ago when Clarence Vane had called him into the office in Laredo, closed the door, and told him very quietly that the witnesses had been found, that the case against Holt had been buried, and that Benjamin's continued good health depended on his immediate resignation and departure from the district. Benjamin had not resigned. He had instead gone to the federal courthouse in San Antonio by a roundabout route to file the evidence he'd collected directly with the federal prosecutor. It had taken a week. The federal prosecutor had been cautious but interested. He had issued arrest warrants for Doran Holt and Clarence Vane, and he had sent copies to the U.S. Marshal in Washington. What Benjamin had not known was that Clarence Vane had a cousin in San Antonio who worked as a court clerk, and who had sent word the moment Benjamin walked through the federal courthouse doors. By the time Benjamin was riding back toward Laredo with the warrant secured, and a federal escort arranged 2 deputy marshals from the San Antonio office who would arrive in 3 days, Doran Holt had assembled 8 men and was moving to intercept him. Clarence Vane had added 4 more, 12 guns, chasing a man with 2 colts and a horse that was rapidly running out of strength. Benjamin had not gone toward Laredo. He had gone toward the river. His plan, such as it was, required him to cross south into Mexico, reach the small town of Piedras Negras, and make contact with a Mexican federal officer named Captain Reyes, who owed him a professional debt from a previous case. Captain Reyes could provide temporary refuge and, more importantly, could relay messages to the federal authorities in San Antonio without going through any channel that Clarence Vane controlled. Once the San Antonio deputies arrived, the situation would resolve itself through legitimate authority. The plan was not without risk. The chief risk at this moment was that the border crossing Benjamin had intended to use was guarded by 2 men who reported directly to Doran Holt. That left the river. That left Georgia Slater's ferry. He had known about her operation by reputation. Most people in the border country did. Georgia Slater had been running the ferry crossing at Cypress Bend for 4 years, having taken it over from her father when he died of fever in 1879. She was known along the river as reliable, fair, and completely disinclined to be pushed around by anyone. Smugglers used her. Honest settlers used her. Rangers used her. She charged them all the same rate and asked each of them the same questions, and she turned back anyone who struck her as likely to bring violence to her crossing. Benjamin had been hoping, when he left San Antonio, that Georgia Slater would decide he was not that kind of man. Now he stood at the edge of her dock in the dark, watching her face in the lantern light, while the river roared behind her, and somewhere to the northeast, he could hear the distant drum of hooves that might have been anything but that he was fairly sure was 12 men who wanted him dead. Georgia Slater had listened to the whole explanation without interrupting once. That alone was unusual enough to register with Benjamin as significant. Most people he dealt with on the frontier interrupted constantly, to dispute, to question, to insert their own understanding of events. Georgia had simply stood there with her rifle and her lantern and her dark eyes moving steadily over his face as though she were reading him the way someone reads a map, checking each landmark against what they already know about the territory. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You said you have the warrants with you," she said. "Copies. The originals are filed in San Antonio. Let me see the copies." He reached into his coat and produced a folded set of papers. She set the lantern on a post, slung the rifle over her shoulder, and read through the documents in the lantern light with the methodical attention of someone who understood what they were looking at. Her lips moved slightly on the legal language, not because she needed the help but because she was memorizing the specific charges and names. "You know federal warrant procedure," he said. It was not a question. "My father was a county clerk in Georgia before he came west," she said, without looking up from the papers. "He taught me to read every kind of legal document before he taught me to pole a flatboat. Useful skills in that order, he always said." She handed the papers back. "The warrants look legitimate," she said. "But I want to be clear about something before I agree to anything, Benjamin Reed. I am not in the habit of making myself a party to situations that put my ferry crossing, my equipment, or my person at significant risk without a proportionate return. I said I can pay." "I'm not talking about money right now," Georgia said. "Though we'll discuss money. I'm talking about the fact that you have 12 men behind you, and my dock and my boat and my home are on this side of the river, and I have to continue living here after tonight." Benjamin looked at her steadily. The sound of hooves was louder now. "What do you need?" he asked. "I need to know that when those federal deputies arrive from San Antonio in 3 days, the name of Georgia Slater and the location of this crossing are part of the official record," she said. "I need it documented that I assisted a federal officer in good faith. That protects me legally if Doran Holt or Clarence Vane decides to make trouble for me afterward." "I can give you a signed statement right now," he said. "You don't have time right now," she said, and she was already moving toward the stern of the flatboat, pulling free the mooring rope with quick, practiced hands. "Give it to me on the other side. Get your horse on the boat and do it quickly. And hold that lantern low. I don't want them to see the light before we're well into the current." Benjamin Reed had been to war metaphorically for 7 years, and he had faced men who were faster and meaner and better armed than him, and he had stood in courthouse hallways while federal judges debated the merits of his cases with the casual authority of men who had never once worried about whether someone was going to shoot them from behind a wagon. He had not, in any of those situations, felt the particular quality of surprise he felt now, watching Georgia Slater move around her flatboat in the dark, with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times and the quiet command of someone who had never once needed anyone's permission to do it. She had made her decision. She had made it on her own terms. And now she was executing it with a competence that made him feel, for just a moment, like the less capable person on this dock. He loaded his horse onto the flatboat. The animal was exhausted enough to go without protest, and he tied it to the center post Georgia indicated with a quick gesture. She was already at the long steering oar at the stern, reading the water with her eyes in a way that told him she could see things in the current that he could not, eddies and depths, and the invisible architecture of a river she had crossed hundreds of times. "Stay low and stay quiet," she said. "The current runs fast through the middle passage. It's going to feel wrong. Let me handle it." The sound of riders was closer now, and then suddenly there was a shout from the eastern bank above the dock, a voice he didn't recognize calling for the ferry woman. Georgia Slater pushed off from the dock with the long pole, and the flatboat swung into the current, and the darkness of the Rio Grande swallowed them whole. The crossing took 18 minutes. Benjamin Reed counted them while crouched at the front of the flatboat with his hand on his horse's nose to keep the animal quiet, and his eyes on the northern bank where he could see the moving orange sparks of torches. They had found the dock. He could hear men shouting, and once there was the crack of a rifle and a splash well short of the boat, and then George's voice, very low and perfectly calm. "They can't see us. Stay still." She was right. In the darkness of the current, with the lantern extinguished, the flatboat was invisible from the northern bank. The river carried them south and west as she worked the steering oar with a steady powerful rhythm, reading the current by feel and experience, and some interior knowledge of the water that Benjamin couldn't begin to understand. Once the boat lurched hard to the left, and he grabbed the center post, and Georgia said nothing, just shifted her grip on the oar and corrected the drift with 2 hard pushes that brought them back on course. They touched the southern bank 20 yards downstream of a cluster of river willows, and Georgia drove the nose of the boat into the mud shelf with a practiced thump and stepped onto the bank before Benjamin had fully registered they'd arrived. "Welcome to Mexico," she said, and she began pulling the boat up onto the shelf with a rope looped around a buried post. "Help me with the bow line, and then you can tie your horse to that cottonwood." He helped her secure the boat. His hands were steadier than his heartbeat, which was still running hot from the crossing, and from something else he didn't entirely want to examine yet. Something that had started when she'd read his warrant documents with that careful, methodical attention, and said my father taught me to read every kind of legal document before he taught me to pole a flatboat. When the boat was secure, she turned to face him in the darkness. The torches on the northern bank were still visible across the river, moving along the bank as the men searched, but they were far enough away that the immediate danger had passed. "Signed statement," Georgia said. He almost laughed. He pulled out his notebook, a small, leather-bound thing he'd carried for 7 years, and he wrote the statement by the light of a match she produced from her coat pocket, documenting her assistance, her identity, the date, and the location of the crossing. He signed it with his full name and added his federal deputy identification number. She folded the paper and put it inside her coat. "Piedras Negras is 7 miles southeast," she said. "The road is rough but passable. Your horse needs water before you go. There's a seep spring 20 yards up from the bank." "You're not going back across tonight," he said. It was not a question. "Not with 12 armed men on my dock." She said it matter-of-factly, without complaint. "I'll camp on this side until morning and go back when they've moved on. It won't be the first time." Benjamin looked at her for a moment. The match had gone out and he could only see the outline of her, tall for a woman, straight-shouldered, with the Winchester still slung across her back and her dark hair tied back under a battered hat that had seen considerable frontier weather. "Come with me to Piedras Negras," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "Because if Doran Holt figures out who helped me across tonight, which he will eventually, he's going to come back to your crossing and make trouble for you. And you'll be safer with me tonight than alone on a riverbank." Georgia Slater considered this. She was not a woman who accepted offers of protection reflexively. He could see that in the way she stood, in the slight narrowing of her eyes, in the pause that meant she was actually evaluating the logic rather than simply deciding whether to be grateful. "You've got a point," she said finally. "But I want it understood that I'm not going with you because I need protection. I'm going because the tactical situation supports it, and I don't feel like spending a night on a muddy riverbank when there's a town 7 miles away." "Understood completely," he said. They walked the horse to the spring and let it drink, and then they set out southeast through the Mesquite and Chaparral toward Piedras Negras, and Benjamin Reed was aware, as he walked beside Georgia Slater in the dark, that something had shifted in the architecture of his evening. In the architecture, perhaps, of things considerably larger than this single evening, and he wasn't entirely certain what to do with that awareness except to keep walking and see where it led. The town of Piedras Negras in 1883 was a border settlement of perhaps 2,000 souls, straddling the line between the frontier economy of Texas and the struggling Republican government of Porfirian Mexico, with the pragmatic adaptability of a place that had long since learned to profit from its position on the edge of 2 worlds. There were cantinas and mercantile stores, a small Catholic church whose bell tower was the tallest structure for 20 miles in any direction, a garrison of Mexican federal soldiers, and a population that included vaqueros and merchants and former outlaws and several families of Kickapoo who had found a strange and tenuous peace on the Mexican side of the river. Captain Ernesto Reyes received them in his garrison office at 2 in the morning, with the resigned equanimity of a man accustomed to being awakened by crisis. He was a compact, dark-eyed man in his 40s who shook hands with Benjamin with the warmth of genuine professional regard and assessed Georgia Slater with a raised eyebrow and a nod that conveyed considerable respect. "The ferry woman from Cypress Bend," he said, in English that was careful and precise. "Your reputation crosses the river, Señorita Slater." "Most of the trouble I've seen has crossed the river in the other direction," she said, which made Captain Reyes laugh. Reyes provided them with safe quarters in the garrison, sent his fastest courier to San Antonio that same night carrying Benjamin's dispatches and a formal letter from the Mexican Federal Command acknowledging the situation, and arranged for armed guards at the garrison gate. The situation was, Reyes explained with the controlled precision of a military man who had seen many such situations, essentially a waiting exercise. The San Antonio deputies would arrive. The warrants would be executed. The corrupt Marshal Clarence Vane would be arrested. Doran Holt and his men, unable to cross the river without triggering an international incident that neither government wanted, would effectively be contained until proper federal authority arrived to handle them. 3 days, Reyes said. "Perhaps 4. Rest, eat. The garrison cooks make a very reasonable breakfast." They were given separate quarters, a room for Benjamin, a room for Georgia, both of them simple whitewashed spaces with cot beds and a basin of water and the particular austere cleanliness of military lodging. Benjamin lay on his cot for an hour without sleeping, listening to the sounds of the garrison and the distant murmur of the town, and thinking about Georgia Slater reading his warrant documents by lantern light, with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at. He had known a great many competent people in his 7 years as a deputy marshal. He had worked alongside rangers who could track a man across bare rock and scouts who could navigate by starlight with the precision of a surveyor. He had respected all of them, in the way you respect a tool that does its job without breaking. What he felt about Georgia Slater was something different, and the difference was giving him considerable difficulty because he couldn't quite locate where it was coming from. Part of it was the crossing. He had been on ferries and flatboats many times in his life, and he had crossed the Rio Grande at various points over the years, and he knew enough about rivers to know that what Georgia had done in the dark, reading the current without a lantern, correcting the drift of a loaded flatboat with a single steering oar while men with rifles were searching the northern bank, was not a simple thing. It was not a thing that most people could have done. It was a thing that required years of accumulated knowledge and a kind of physical intelligence that was entirely distinct from book learning, and she had done it with the calm efficiency of someone for whom the dramatic was simply Tuesday. He got up before dawn and went to find coffee, and Georgia was already awake and sitting at the garrison table with Captain Reyes's map of the Rio Grande region spread out in front of her, marking notations in pencil with the focused expression of someone doing serious work. "You're up early," he said. "I was thinking about your situation," she said, without looking up from the map. "Specifically about the gap in your plan." He poured himself coffee from the pot on the garrison stove and sat across from her. "What gap?" "The San Antonio deputies arrive in 3 days," she said. "They have warrants for Holt and Vane, but Holt has 12 armed men and Vane controls the local deputy marshal office in Laredo. If Holt hears the San Antonio deputies are coming, he could move his operation across the border himself before the warrants are executed. He has contacts in Piedras Negras. I know this because 2 of his mules crossed at my ferry last spring, and I have their names written in my log." Benjamin set down his coffee cup. "You keep a log of your crossings. Every single one. Date, description of party, stated purpose, and any unusual details. 4 years of records." She finally looked up from the map. "I have Holt's men in my log. I have dates. I have the direction they were traveling and the cargo descriptions I was able to observe. Some of them were carrying items that don't match any legitimate commerce explanation. If your federal prosecutor sees my logs, it adds an evidentiary layer to the case against Holt that doesn't depend solely on your witnesses." Benjamin stared at her. Georgia Slater was looking at him with the patient expression of someone who has said a logical thing and is waiting for the other person to process it. "Where are the logs?" he asked. "In a trunk under my dock storage room," she said, "which is currently on the north side of the river. We need those logs." "Yes," she said, "I know. I've been working on how to get them." She tapped the map. "Your 12 gunmen are looking for you specifically. They don't have any particular reason to bother my property if you're not there. If I go back across in the morning alone, I can retrieve the logs and bring them south. It's dangerous. Less dangerous for me than for you," she said simply. "They want you dead. They have no specific grudge against me yet. As long as I move carefully and quickly, it's manageable." "I don't like it," Benjamin said. "You don't have to like it," Georgia said, with a mildness that somehow carried considerable steel in it. "I'm not asking for your approval. I'm telling you my assessment of the situation and my proposed course of action." He looked at her across the table. The early morning light was coming through the garrison window, gray and thin, and it caught the angles of her face. A face that was not conventionally pretty in the way the women in the Laredo saloons were pretty, but that had a quality of presence, of coherent personhood, that Benjamin found considerably more compelling than conventional prettiness. She had a strong jaw and dark eyes and the particular kind of steadiness in her expression that comes from years of making solitary decisions in difficult circumstances and living with the results. "All right," he said, "but I want to establish a signal. If there's trouble at your crossing, you fire 2 shots in rapid succession. Captain Reyes has men who can reach the northern bank in 30 minutes. Georgia considered this. 30 minutes is a long time if things go wrong. It's what I can arrange." "Then I'll make sure things don't go wrong," she said, and she returned to the map. She went back across that morning. Benjamin watched the flatboat from the Mexican bank until it disappeared into the river willows on the north side, and then he spent the most uncomfortable 4 hours of his recent memory waiting for 2 shots that did not come. She came back with a leather satchel containing 4 notebooks, a tin box of receipts, and a calm expression that told him everything had gone smoothly. And then she spent the rest of the afternoon sitting with Captain Reyes and his most educated sergeant, organizing the log entries into a coherent evidentiary timeline, while Benjamin worked on his own written account of the investigation. They had dinner together that evening in the garrison's small mess, and the conversation moved through the work and then gradually, as conversations do, when 2 people have been doing serious things together all day, and the serious things are temporarily resolved into something else. "How long have you been at Cypress Bend?" he asked. 4 years in September," she said. "My father bought the ferry license in '79. We came out from Georgia, the state, not me, in '75 when the Reconstruction economy collapsed, and my father decided Texas was the only place left where a man who'd backed the wrong side in the war could start clean. He backed the Confederacy." "He did not," she said, and there was a quiet weight in the words. "He backed the Union, in Georgia, in 1861, which, as you might imagine, was not a popular position in rural Bibb County." She looked at her plate for a moment. "My mother's family stopped speaking to us. Some of my father's business associates had their property damaged. After the war, when you'd think things might have been better, they were in some ways worse. Reconstruction politics in Georgia were brutal and ugly, and my father had been on the winning side in principle but the losing side in practice, if you understand what I mean. So you came west." "We came west," she said. "My father, my mother, my brother Samuel, and me. My mother died on the trail cholera, 1876, just past the Pecos River. Samuel went to the New Mexico Territory and became a sheep rancher. My father and I came to the river because he'd heard there was money in ferry licenses and he had enough capital from selling the Georgia property to buy in. And when he died, I kept running it," she said simply. "Some people thought I wouldn't last 6 months. A woman alone, running a river crossing in the border country. A county commissioner tried to revoke my license on the grounds that a female operator represented. She paused, and her tone became precisely dry, an inappropriate use of a commercial waterway license. I filed a legal challenge citing the Texas Constitution and the relevant commerce statutes, and I represented myself because I couldn't afford a lawyer and the commissioner's petition was denied. Benjamin set down his fork. He was staring at her again, he realized. He seemed to be making a habit of it. "You argued your own legal case," he said. "I told you my father taught me to read legal documents," she said. "He was thorough about it." A small smile crossed her face, the first genuinely unguarded expression he'd seen from her, quick and a little self-aware. The commissioner was not pleased. He's been not pleased for 3 years. It doesn't appear to be having any significant effect on my operations. Benjamin laughed. It came out before he decided to do it, and it was a genuine laugh, the kind that requires a real finding of something funny rather than the social performance of amusement. Georgia's smile deepened slightly, and she picked up her fork, and something in the air between them changed quality in a way that Benjamin noticed with the part of his attention that was not technically focused on the legal situation or the dinner or anything else he could name. The next 2 days passed in a strange suspension of reality that Benjamin would later think of as one of the most unusual and formative stretches of time in his life. The garrison was safe. The work was ongoing, organizing evidence, writing statements, coordinating with Captain Reyes's dispatch riders who carried messages back and forth across the border through channels that bypassed Clarence Vane's compromised office entirely. Benjamin and Georgia worked together with an efficiency that grew daily, developing the kind of professional shorthand that usually takes months of partnership to establish, and that they seemed to arrive at within hours. She would identify a gap in the evidentiary record. He would produce documents from his own investigation that filled it. He would struggle with a point of federal law. She would locate the relevant statute from memory and cite it correctly. On the second evening, a dispatch rider came back from San Antonio with news that the federal deputies were 1 day out, and also with a private message for Benjamin from the federal prosecutor that complicated things in a new and specific way. The prosecutor had received the evidence package. He was satisfied with its quality. The warrants would be executed, and the case against Holt and Vane would proceed. However, he needed a key witness to appear in San Antonio within 10 days to provide formal testimony before the federal grand jury. The witness he needed was the individual who could best testify to the evidentiary record of Holt's smuggling operation, the ferry logs, the crossing records, the pattern of activity over 4 years. He needed Georgia Slater. Benjamin read the message 3 times and then he went to find her. She was sitting on the garrison wall in the late evening light, looking south toward the interior of Mexico with an expression he hadn't seen from her before, not quite wistful, but something in that neighborhood. Thoughtful in a way that was personal rather than analytical, he told her about the prosecutor's request. She was quiet for a long moment. "San Antonio," she said, 10 days. "They'll cover your travel expenses and compensate you for the time away from the crossing." "It's not the expense," she said. She stopped. "I haven't been away from the crossing for more than 2 days since my father died. I know what it sounds like, but it's my place. It's the thing I built, the thing I kept." She looked down at her hands. "Every time I'm away from it, I'm aware that it could fall apart, that something could go wrong, that the commissioner might find another angle to challenge the license." "Nothing's going to happen to your crossing in 10 days, he said. "You don't know that." "No," he agreed. "But I know that your testimony could put Doran Holt in a federal penitentiary and remove one of the most dangerous smuggling operations from this stretch of the border. And that would probably be better for your crossing in the long run than almost anything else you could do." She looked at him. The evening light was orange and low, and it was doing something very specific to the angles of her face, and Benjamin was aware that he was having feelings about Georgia Slater that he had not had about a woman in a considerable number of years. possibly ever, in quite this specific combination of admiration and warmth, and something that felt uncomfortably close to the terrifying recognition of something important. "You're not wrong," she said, quietly. "I'm right more often than people expect," he said. "It's one of my better qualities." The corner of her mouth curved. "What are your worst qualities?" "I've been told I'm inflexible," he said, "and that I have difficulty letting things go once I've decided they matter." "Those sound like virtues to me," she said. "Depending on what you decide matters." The silence between them was a comfortable silence now, the kind that doesn't require filling, the kind that has, in itself, a specific quality of companionship. Benjamin was aware that he was sitting closer to her than was strictly necessary on the garrison wall, and that she had not moved away, and that this fact was producing in him a very specific and warm adjacent category of feeling. "Georgia," he said. She turned to look at him. "I want to say something that I hope you'll take in the spirit in which it's intended," he said, "which is entirely sincere and not in any way condescending." "All right," she said, with the careful neutrality of someone ready for something to be condescending. "What you did on that river," he said. "The crossing in the dark with 12 armed men on the bank, that was the most impressive piece of practical skill I have ever seen from anyone. In 7 years of working with marshals and ranger and soldiers and scouts, I've watched men who were supposed to be exceptional at their jobs, and I've respected what they could do, but I have never, not once, been genuinely astonished by someone's competence in the middle of a dangerous situation. You astonished me." Georgia Slater looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face. He couldn't entirely read it. There were too many layers, but the predominant element seemed to be a kind of surprised vulnerability, as though she was encountering something she hadn't entirely prepared for. "Most people patronize it," she said finally, "when they notice it at all. They say something like, 'Well done for a woman,' or they're surprised that I didn't need help." "I know," he said, "which is why I want to be clear that what I'm saying has nothing to do with the fact that you're a woman. It has to do with the fact that you did something extraordinary, and I don't think I would have survived that night without you, and I want you to know that I know that." The silence after that had a different quality than the previous silences. It was the silence of two people who have said something true and are sitting in the weight of it. "Thank you," Georgia said at last. It was very simple and very sincere, and somehow those two words contained considerably more than two words normally contain. Benjamin looked at the orange sky over Mexico and thought about the 7 years behind him and the uncertain weeks ahead, and the woman sitting beside him on the garrison wall, and he thought that he had not in a long time been in a situation that felt both dangerous and exactly right, and that the feeling was not entirely unpleasant. The federal deputies arrived the following morning, 2 solid, capable men named Hargrove and Delacroix, who wore their San Antonio authority with the comfortable ease of people who had not yet been corrupted by proximity to power. They crossed the river at Cypress Bend, which Doran Holt's men had apparently abandoned sometime during the night, and they arrived at the Piedras Negras garrison with a full account of the situation north of the river. Doran Holt had indeed attempted to cross into Mexico. He had sent 3 men ahead to arrange passage through a crossing 15 miles east of Cypress Bend. Those 3 men had been met by Reyes's rurals, who had detained them without ceremony in the Piedras Negras jail. Holt himself, on learning this, had apparently reconsidered his options and was last reported heading north toward the interior of Texas, which was not a direction that led anywhere useful for a man with federal warrants in his name. Clarence Vane had been considerably less clever about the whole situation. He had still been in his Laredo office when the San Antonio deputies arrived with his warrant, apparently believing until the last possible moment that his connections and his brother-in-law's influence would protect him. They had not. He was currently in the Laredo City jail awaiting transfer to San Antonio for arraignment. Holt would be found. Benjamin was certain of that in the specific, settled way he was certain of things that were a matter of procedure and persistence, rather than luck. The federal machinery, once engaged, was slow but thorough. Holt's network of contacts in the border country had been comprehensively disrupted by the events of the past week, and a man without his network in Texas in 1883 was a man with very limited options. "You're free to return to your crossing," Deputy Hargrove told Georgia, with the pragmatic courtesy of someone who respected what she'd contributed. "And the prosecutor is very serious about that testimony request. He thinks your logs are the strongest piece of documentary evidence in the case." "I'll be in San Antonio in 8 days," Georgia said. Benjamin looked at her. She had not hesitated. She caught his look and gave him a slight shrug that meant approximately, "You were right, I know. Please don't make a production of it." He pressed his lips together to prevent a smile and returned to the business of transferring the evidence packages to Hargrove and Delacroix. They rode north together, Georgia and Benjamin, following the deputies back towards Cypress Bend through the late morning heat of the border country, and the landscape was the same chaparral and mesquite and dry limestone that it had always been, but it felt different to Benjamin than it had a week ago. The quality of the light was different. The sound of the cicadas in the brush was different. He was aware of Georgia beside him in a way that had nothing to do with tactical assessment, and everything to do with the fact that he had spent 4 days in her company, and could not identify a single thing about her that he would want to be otherwise. At the river crossing, the deputies went ahead across on the flatboat while Georgia secured it on the southern bank for the return trip. Benjamin stood beside his horse and watched her work and tried to compose a sentence that said what he wanted to say without overreaching or being foolish about it. "I have something to ask you," he said. Georgia finished knotting the bow line and stood up. She had mud on her boots from the river bank and the Winchester on her shoulder and her hat pushed back from her forehead, and she looked, as she had looked at every other moment he'd known her, entirely herself. "Ask then," she said. "After San Antonio," he said. "After the testimony and the grand jury and everything is settled. I'd like to come back to this crossing and spend some time that isn't driven by emergency." He paused. "I'd like to spend that time with you." Georgia was quiet. The river ran. The cicadas insisted on being heard. "I should tell you something first," she said. "Something that might affect your thinking." "All right." "I'm not going to change," she said. "I'm not going to become quieter or more accommodating or less likely to argue with you when you're wrong. I'm not going to stop running the ferry, and I'm not going to run it any differently than I run it now. If you're thinking of this in terms of some eventual settled arrangement that looks like a conventional arrangement, I need you to understand that my version of settled looks like what you've seen this week, and some men find that uncomfortable." Benjamin looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, quite honestly, "The men who find that uncomfortable are men who don't deserve it." Something shifted in George's expression. Something opened a little some carefully maintained reserve that she had been holding, he realized, not out of coldness but out of long practice at protecting what was hers, including herself. "Come back to this crossing," she said, "in 10 days after San Antonio. And we'll see what time that isn't driven by emergency looks like." He rode north with the deputies. He looked back once at the river and at the flatboat rocking against the southern bank, and at the figure of Georgia Slater moving up toward the dock with the long pole on her shoulder, and he thought, yes, that, whatever that is. The testimony in San Antonio took 3 days. Georgia arrived as she'd said she would, on time, prepared, with her 4 notebooks organized in precise chronological order and annotations. She had written in the garrison at Piedras Negras that cross-referenced specific crossing events with dates from Benjamin's own investigative timeline. She sat before the federal grand jury in the tall-windowed courthouse and answered every question with the exact and careful precision of someone who had been telling the truth their whole life and found it considerably less complicated than the alternative. The federal prosecutor told Benjamin afterward that in 20 years of practice, he had never had a lay witness provide more credible or more usefully organized testimony. Where did she train? He asked, meaning legally, and Benjamin said she was self-taught, and the prosecutor shook his head slowly with the expression of a man recalibrating something. Benjamin found Georgia in the hotel dining room after the second day of testimony, and she was reading a newspaper with the focused attention she gave everything, and she looked up when he came in and her face did the thing, that slight softening around the eyes that it had begun doing when she looked at him, and he thought, there it is. The prosecutor is satisfied, he told her, sitting down across from her. Good, she said. I'd like to go home. One more day, he said. Then we go home. She noticed his use of the word and looked at him. To the crossing, she said carefully. To the crossing, he agreed and met her eyes and did not qualify the statement further. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she returned to her newspaper, but the softening around her eyes did not go away. On the third day, the grand jury indicted Doran Holt in absentia on 12 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Commissioner Aldridge Polk. Clarence Vane was indicted on 7 counts of corruption and conspiracy. The prosecutor was confident of conviction in both cases. That evening, Benjamin and Georgia ate dinner together in a San Antonio restaurant that was considerably fancier than the Garrison Mess in Piedras Negras, and they talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with warrants or smuggling or federal procedure. They talked about Georgia's early years in Texas and the particular loneliness of the river crossing in winter when traffic slowed and the days were short and gray. They talked about Benjamin's 7 years as a deputy and the cases that had sat right with him and the ones that hadn't. They talked about what justice meant on a frontier where the law was real, but its enforcement was complicated by geography and corruption and the sheer vast scale of a land that was still being organized into something legible. Georgia said something that stayed with Benjamin long after she said it. The law out here is only as good as the people enforcing it. Which means the people matter more than the law in the end. The law is just a framework. The people are what's real. He thought about that for a long time. And he thought about the fact that Georgia Slater was one of the people who were real, more fully and deliberately herself than almost anyone he'd met, and that he was sitting across from her in a San Antonio restaurant in the lamplight and feeling something that he recognized, with the steady certainty that was one of his better qualities, as the specific and irreversible orientation of a heart that has found where it belongs. He did not say this at dinner. He was not ready to say it yet, and he could see that she was not ready to hear it yet, and the timing of things mattered to both of them. They rode back to the Rio Grande border together, 2 days south from San Antonio, through the hill country and then the Mesquite Plains, and then the limestone borderland where the river carved its ancient path through the Texas rock. They made camp the first night near a creek, and Georgia built the fire with the same efficient competence she brought to everything, and they ate from provisions they'd bought at the last town, and the conversation was easy and intermittent and full of comfortable silence. Benjamin told her about his parents both gone, his mother from a fever when he was 12, his father from a mining accident in Nevada 4 years later, leaving him at 16 with a horse and a rifle and the particular kind of self-sufficient stubbornness that either kills you or makes you into something unexpectedly durable. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished she said quietly, "You made yourself out of your own materials." "I suppose I did," he said. "So did I," she said. And the way she said it felt like a bridge between 2 separate territories, like the river crossing, a connection built from necessity that became, over time, something you crossed just because you wanted to see what was on the other side. On the second night, they camped 10 miles from the crossing, and the stars over the border country were the kind of stars that only appear in places far from city lights, immense and close, and so numerous they created an impression of texture in the sky, as though you could reach up and feel the grain of it. Georgia was sitting beside the fire and looking up, and Benjamin was sitting close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and close enough was no longer good enough. "Georgia," he said. She turned and found him closer than she'd expected, and she didn't pull back. "I know we said we'd see what things looked like after the emergency," he said. "I'm not trying to rush past that, but I want you to know something because I think you deserve to know it clearly rather than sideways." "Say it clearly then," she said. "I have not admired anyone the way I admire you," he said. "Not just for what you can do, though what you can do is remarkable, for the fact of you, the whole fact. The way you think, and the way you move through the world, and the way you've built something real out of circumstances that would have defeated most people. And he took a breath, I am falling in love with you. I want you to know that. Not as a demand and not as a proposal and not as anything that requires an immediate answer, just as a fact that you're entitled to have." Georgia looked at him for a long time. The firelight moved across her face. "You are entirely earnest," she said finally. "It's unusual in a man who carries 2 guns. I find the guns are easier to put down than the earnestness," he said. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I think I'm falling in love with you too. I want to be careful about it because I'm always careful and because some things matter enough to be careful with." "I'll be careful too," he said. She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee, and they sat like that for a while, looking at the stars over the border country, while the fire burned down and the coyotes called in the mesquite dark, and the whole enormous night pressed around them with the specific warmth of a world that is not entirely indifferent to the small and important things happening within it. They reached Cypress Bend the next morning, and Georgia's dock was exactly as she'd left it, minus some rope marks on the mooring post where Holt's men had apparently tied their horses, but otherwise undamaged. She walked the length of the dock and checked every plank and post with her hands, inspecting the craft for damage, and Benjamin watched her and understood that this was something he'd need to understand about her, that the crossing was not just a business but a thing she'd made, a thing she'd kept, an expression of who she was as fundamental as anything else about her. "Everything's sound," she said, with the satisfaction of someone confirming what they'd hoped. "Good," he said. She turned to look at him. The morning light was clear and gold, and the river moved behind her, and she looked exactly like herself. "So," she said, "you came back to the crossing." "I came back to the crossing," he agreed. "And what happens now?" "Now," Benjamin said, "I'd like your permission to set up a camp on your property and be useful while we figure out what things look like when they're not driven by emergency." "You can camp by the Cottonwood Grove," she said. "And I have a dock that needs recalking if you want to be useful." He did not know how to recalk a dock, but she taught him, with the same patient precision she brought to everything. And by midday he was doing it badly but with improving technique, and she was telling him so with the combination of honesty and mild amusement that he was coming to think of as specifically, particularly hers. The weeks that followed were the best weeks of Benjamin Reed's adult life, which was a thing he acknowledged privately and with some wonder. He had not had best weeks before. He'd had good periods and productive periods and periods of resolution after difficulty, but not this particular quality of daily rightness, of waking up and finding the day already furnished with something worth looking forward to. He helped with the ferry. He learned to read the currents, badly at first and then less badly under Georgia's instruction. He was useful with heavy cargo and with difficult passengers, and his presence provided a deterrent to the occasional individual who tested Georgia's authority in ways he could address with his height and his guns and his quiet willingness to stand very still and look at people until they reconsidered their behavior. He was careful not to overstep, not to make the ferry his operation, or to position himself as its authority. He was Georgia's helper, Georgia's assistant, and later Georgia's partner in the practical daily work, and the boundary of that was one she set and he respected completely. When she made decisions about the crossing he disagreed with, he said so, and she listened to his reasoning and sometimes changed her mind and sometimes didn't, and either way the decisions were hers. In October, A letter came from San Antonio informing them that Doran Holt had been apprehended by federal agents in Colorado, where he had apparently been attempting to establish a new smuggling operation with considerably less success than his Texas operations. He would be extradited to face the federal indictments. Clarence Vane had already been convicted and sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. Georgia read the letter at the kitchen table in the small house behind the dock that she'd built herself 3 years ago with help from a Kickapoo carpenter named Thomas and a Mexican plasterer named Fidel. It was a good house, small and solidly made, with a kitchen that got good morning light and a porch that faced the river and a bedroom that was entirely her own and had been entirely her own for 4 years. "It's done," she said. "It's done," Benjamin agreed. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the tin box where she kept important documents, beside the signed statement he'd written on the Mexican bank of the Rio Grande on their first night together, which she had never removed from the tin box and which he had noticed but not commented on. That evening, they sat on the porch and watched the river in the last light, and Georgia said, without looking at him, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," he said. "What are your plans?" she said, "in the broad sense, not the immediate practical sense." Benjamin considered this honestly. "I resigned my deputy marshal position formally last month," he said. "I sent the letter from San Antonio. I've been thinking about what comes next." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking that what I want comes next is here, at the crossing, with you." Georgia was quiet. The river ran, and egret drifted along the opposite bank. "I've been thinking the same thing," she said carefully, "but I want to be sure we're talking about the same thing." "I'd like to marry you," Benjamin said simply, "if you're willing, on whatever terms you set. The crossing stays yours. It will always be yours. I would never ask or expect anything different. But I want to be here. I want to build a life here with you at this river." Georgia was quiet for a long moment that Benjamin wrote out with the stillness of a man who has learned to wait for things that matter. "I've thought for a long time that I wouldn't marry," she said, "that I didn't need to, and that the men I'd met didn't make it an attractive proposition." She turned to look at him, and the evening light was in her eyes, and something in her expression was warm and open and very unguarded. "You've made me reconsider my position." "Is that a yes?" he said. "That is very much a yes," she said, and then she leaned across the small distance between them on the porch and kissed him, and Benjamin Reed kissed her back with the whole of his considerable earnestness, and the river ran south toward Mexico in the dark, and the stars came out over the border country, and everything was exactly as it should be. They were married in December of 1883, at the small community church in the nearest settlement 12 miles east of the crossing, in a ceremony attended by the handful of people who had earned their genuine regard. Captain Reyes, who crossed the river specifically for the occasion and brought a Mexican silver candelabra as a wedding gift. Deputy Hargrove from the San Antonio office, who shook Benjamin's hand and told Georgia she was the most formidable witness he'd ever seen in a federal court. And Georgia's brother Samuel, who came up from the New Mexico territory with his wife Constance and looked at Benjamin with the measuring assessment of a protective older brother before deciding, apparently, that the man was acceptable. Thomas the Kickapoo carpenter was there, and Fidel the plasterer, and a half-dozen families who used the ferry regularly and who had, over 4 years, come to regard Georgia Slater as something between a neighbor and an institution, someone who was simply part of the landscape of their lives, reliable and capable and entirely her own. The ceremony was conducted by a Methodist minister named Reverend Graves, who was thin and enthusiastic and somewhat thrown off his traditional script by the couple before him, who exchanged vows they had quietly modified in the preceding week. Georgia's vows made no mention of obedience. Benjamin's vows included a specific line about supporting and respecting her work and her authority at the ferry crossing, which caused Reverend Graves to blink twice, and then, apparently, to revise his opinion of the occasion upward. They rode back to the crossing that evening through the winter dark, and Benjamin carried his few remaining possessions into the small house behind the dock, and Georgia made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and looked at each other across the table with the specific quality of people who have said a permanent thing and are beginning to understand what the permanence of it feels like. "We should think about the spare room," Georgia said. "The storage room. It could be a proper spare room," she said. "If we cleared it out and put in a real floor." She was looking at her coffee cup. "I think we might want a proper spare room in a year or two." Benjamin looked at her. She looked up from her coffee cup and met his eyes, and there was a warmth in her expression that was specific and particular and entirely deliberate. "A year or two," he said. "Or perhaps somewhat less," she said. "Depending." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned it over and laced her fingers through his, and the lamp burned and the river ran outside, and the border country was quiet around them in the way it was quiet on good nights, when nothing was wrong and the darkness was just the dark. The following spring brought new traffic to the ferry settlers heading west into the Trans-Pecos country, following the railroad surveys and the optimistic reports in the eastern newspapers about Texas land. Georgia managed the increased traffic with the same systematic efficiency she applied to everything, and Benjamin's presence on the dock proved consistently useful. He had a reputation now along this stretch of the border. The man who'd brought down Holt in vain, the former deputy marshal who'd married the ferry woman and settled at Cypress Bend. That reputation meant that the people who were inclined to test boundaries generally reconsidered before they got close enough to be a serious problem. But more than the deterrent value of his reputation, Benjamin was genuinely useful at the crossing in the way he'd told Georgia he wanted to be, with his hands, and with the patient hard work of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to build. He learned to read the river adequately, though never with Georgia's instinctive fluency. He learned the mechanics of the flatboat thoroughly enough to manage solo crossings when needed. He learned the names and faces and circumstances of the regular traffic, the families and drovers and merchants who used the crossing, and he remembered them the way Georgia remembered them, as people, as specific individuals with specific situations, not as units of commercial traffic. He also kept careful watch for any residual trouble from the Holt network. There was a man who appeared twice at the crossing with a vague bearing that Benjamin didn't like, who turned out on investigation to be a former associate of Holt's testing, whether the crossing was being monitored. Benjamin reported the sightings to the San Antonio office, and the man was quietly arrested while attempting to establish a new smuggling contact in Eagle Pass. The case against Holt's remaining network was largely complete, and the San Antonio prosecutor sent Benjamin a formal letter of appreciation that he pinned to the inside of the storage room door with a horseshoe nail, where it could be seen but not ostentatiously displayed. In July of 1884, Georgia told him she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast, in the straightforward and direct manner with which she conveyed most information, though there was something in the quality of her voice that was different from her ordinary directness, something more careful, more layered. Benjamin sat very still for a moment. Then he got up from the table and went around to her side and knelt beside her chair and took her face in his hands and looked at her with the full weight of everything he felt, which was considerable. "Georgia," he said. "I know," she said, and she was smiling, and it was the most unguarded smile he'd ever seen from her. "I know." He kissed her forehead and her cheeks and her hands, and then he sat back on his heels and looked at her with the specific expression of a man encountering an emotion too large for any of his existing containers. "I'm going to need to finish that spare room," he said. "You've been saying that for 8 months," she said. "I'm going to finish it this week," he said, with the decisiveness of a man who has found his urgency. He finished it that week. Georgia supervised, corrected his measurements twice, and ultimately rebuilt one section of the flooring herself, because his joining was imprecise in a way that would have created a cold draft in winter. He watched her work and did not experience even a flicker of wounded pride about it, because he had stopped experiencing wounded pride about Georgia being better at things than him approximately 8 months ago, when he'd understood that her competence was not a judgment on his, but simply an expression of herself, as natural and unremarkable as the river being faster in spring. Their son was born in February of 1885 in the small house behind the dock, delivered by a midwife named Dolers from the nearby settlement, who had been delivering border country babies for 30 years, and who pronounced the infant healthy and substantial, with the professional satisfaction of a craftsperson pleased with a good result. They named him Thomas Aldridge Reed Thomas for the Kickapoo carpenter who had been Georgia's friend and helper since her first year at the crossing, Aldridge for the slain commissioner, whose murder had set the whole chain of events in motion. Georgia said it felt right to carry his name forward into something living. Thomas Aldridge Reed was, from the first, a person of considerable opinions and strong vocal expression of same. He came into the world apparently uncertain about whether he approved of it and spent several months under investigation before deciding, around his 4th month of life, that it had merit. After that determination, he became enormously good-natured and interested in everything, which were qualities that both his parents found deeply satisfying. The ferry crossing at Cypress Bend continued to grow. In 1886, the Texas legislature formalized the crossing as a certified commercial river transit point, which came with a modest government stipend and a legal status that finally silenced the county commissioner who had been attempting to revoke Georgia's license for the past 6 years. The commissioner retired from office that year, and his replacement was a practical woman named Mrs. Crawford, who had no interest in challenging operating business licenses and considerable interest in the tax revenue the crossing generated. Georgia used the government stipend to purchase a second flatboat, a larger craft that could handle wagon teams and heavy freight without straining the rigging, and hired a young man named Raphael, the son of a Mexican family she had known for years, to help with the increased traffic. Raphael was quick and careful and good with the boats, and Georgia taught him to read the river with the same patient thoroughness with which she taught Benjamin, and within a year he was managing solo crossings with competence. Benjamin, freed from some of the daily operational demands of the crossing, spent part of his time in the San Antonio federal office as a consulting investigator, not a full appointment, but a contracted arrangement where he was called in for specific cases in the border country that required someone with his combination of knowledge and local credibility. It was work he was good at, and that carried him away from the crossing for stretches of a week or two several times a year, which he found difficult in the way you find difficult any absence from the thing that matters most, but which Georgia managed with her characteristic self-sufficiency, and which Thomas navigated with the philosophical adaptability of a small child who had never known anything but a frontier life. On the occasions he returned from those trips, the moment he came down the slope toward the dock and saw the flatboat on the water and Georgia at the stern with the steering oar, or saw her on the dock organizing cargo with the quick economy of long practice, was a moment that he carried with him deliberately. The specific sight of her, at her work, in her element, at the place she'd made and kept and refused to surrender to anyone who wanted to take it from her. In the fall of 1887, Georgia told him she was expecting again, and then she told him she was fairly certain it was twins, which she had suspected from the particular nature of her discomfort for the past 6 weeks, and she said this with an expression that was equal parts composed and extremely aware of the enormity of what she was composing herself about. "Twins," Benjamin said. "Probably," she said. Dolers agreed when I described the symptoms. He sat down on the dock, which was the nearest available surface. "We're going to need help," he said. "We have Raphael," she said. "For the crossing," he said. "I mean in the house." Georgia sat down beside him on the dock. The river ran. A heron lifted from the bank downstream. "My sister-in-law Constance has a cousin," she said. "A woman named me, recently widowed. She wrote to me last spring asking if there was work in the border country. I told her not currently. I could write back." "Write back," he said. "Yes," she said. "I intend to." She looked at him. "You're not going to say anything else dramatic?" "I'm thinking it," he said. "I'm choosing not to say it." She took his hand and held it, and they sat on the dock while the river moved south past them, and the light fell through the cottonwoods in the long gold angles of autumn, and Benjamin thought, this, all of this, all of it. Mia arrived in December, a capable and warm-natured woman in her 30s, who fit into the household with the natural ease of someone who had needed a new beginning and found one. The twins arrived in March of 1888, two girls, born within 20 minutes of each other, both entirely healthy and both possessed from the first of an alarming degree of mutual awareness that Dolers said she'd seen in twins before, and that meant a lifetime of never quite knowing what they were planning together. They were named Clara and Rose, after Georgia's maternal grandmother and Benjamin's mother respectively, and they grew into the house and the crossing and the particular landscape of the border river, with the adaptability of children raised in a place where the world is wide and the work is real, and the people around them take both seriously. Thomas, at 3, was initially uncertain about the twins. He surveyed them from the edge of the room with the measured assessment that was unmistakably his mother's expression on his father's face, and then he apparently decided they were acceptable and adopted a proprietary protectiveness toward them that he maintained consistently throughout their shared childhood. The years at Cypress Bend settled into the specific rhythm of a life that is both ordinary and extraordinary, ordinary in its daily demands and repetitions, extraordinary in the accumulation of what it meant and what it built. The crossing grew and was managed. The children grew and were raised. Benjamin's consulting work with the federal office became, over time, a recognized specialty in border country law enforcement that other marshals and prosecutors sought his advice on, and Georgia's logs and records of the crossing, kept now in a series of leather-bound books with the same meticulous care she'd brought to the original notebooks, became an invaluable resource for the federal case archive, referenced in 3 separate prosecutions over the years. They argued sometimes, as two strong and intelligent people who share a life and hold independent opinions will inevitably argue. They argued about the crossing's finances and about Thomas's education, and once at considerable length about whether to invest in a telegraph line connection that Benjamin thought was necessary, and Georgia thought was premature. Georgia turned out to be right about the telegraph line, which did not surprise Benjamin, and he told her so, which she acknowledged with the brief and unrepeatable smile she produced on occasions when she had been right and knew it and was pleased about it. They were not always easy with each other. There were difficult seasons, a year when drought dropped the river traffic to a fraction of its normal volume, and the finances were genuinely strained, and the tension of that leaked into the household in ways that required deliberate management. There were months when Benjamin's consulting work kept him away too long, and George's self-sufficiency hardened slightly around its edges into something he had to work carefully to soften back. There were evenings when exhaustion and the accumulated weight of a hard life showed in both of them, and the conversation was short, and the silences less companionable than usual. But there were also the other evenings, the ones that Benjamin counted as the substance of the life, Georgia reading at the kitchen table while the lamp burned, and the children slept, looking up when he came in with the expression that was warm and specific in his. Mornings at the dock when the river was low and clear, and she would point out something in the water to him with the proprietary affection of someone showing you a thing they love. Moments in the middle of a night when one of the twins was ill or Thomas was coughing, and they handled it together in the kitchen with the coordinated ease of two people who have done difficult things together for long enough that the difficulty itself has become a kind of shared language. In 1891, Doran Holt was convicted in the San Antonio federal court on 10 of the 12 original counts, and sentenced to 22 years in the federal penitentiary at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The verdict was reported in the San Antonio Express and in several other Texas newspapers, and a copy of the Express reached Cypress Bend on the third day after the verdict, carried by a settler family who knew the Reeds knew the case. Georgia read the article at breakfast and folded the newspaper precisely and put it on the table without comment. 22 years, Benjamin said. At least, she said. He won't survive it at his age. No, Benjamin agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Thomas was at the table eating porridge with the focused attention of a 6-year-old who has not yet decided whether this is a good morning for conversation. The twins were still asleep. Aldrich Polk's widow still lives in Laredo, Georgia said. I've corresponded with her occasionally. I should write and tell her. That's a good idea, Benjamin said. Georgia got up from the table and went to her writing desk and wrote the letter while Thomas finished his porridge, and the morning light came in through the east window, and the river ran past outside. She wrote for a long time, which meant she was saying something substantial, and when she finished she sealed the letter and set it with the outgoing mail and came back to the table and poured herself more coffee and sat down. It's finished, she said. Yes, he said. All of it, she said. Everything that started that night at the dock. He looked across the table at her. She was 34 years old and had run a river crossing for 12 years and raised 3 children, and argued her own legal case before a Texas county commissioner and testified before a federal grand jury and built a small house behind a dock with her own hands and his, and she looked like someone who had lived a full and serious life and was not finished living it. Not everything, he said. The good parts aren't finished. She met his eyes. The morning light was on her face, and Thomas said something about wanting more honey on his porridge, and outside the cottonwoods moved in the spring wind and the river moved south as it always moved, and Georgia Slater read Ferry Woman, River Reader, Keeper of Logs and Legal Statutes, and the crossing at Cypress Bend, smiled at her husband with the full warmth of a woman who has built the life she chose and shares it with someone who deserves it. No, she said. The good parts aren't finished at all. The years continue to pass over the crossing at Cypress Bend, with the impartial generosity that time offers to all things equally, the good and the hard alike receiving their full measure. Thomas grew into a careful, serious boy with his mother's analytical mind and his father's physical capability, and at 14, he was managing solo crossings with a skill that made Georgia watch him from the bank with the particular expression she saved for things that genuinely impressed her. He would take the crossing eventually, they both knew, though he would also leave it first, go somewhere and learn things, and come back with a broader view of the river and the world it moved through. Clara and Rose grew into themselves in the particular way of twins who are distinct people who happen to have been born together. Clara more outward and assertive, Rose more interior and precise, both of them possessed of their mother's intelligence and their father's stubbornness, and the specific competence of children raised in a place where competence was the household currency. The border country changed around them. The railroads came closer. The towns grew. The legal framework of Texas tightened and formalized, and the wild, competing authority landscape that Benjamin had navigated for 7 years as a deputy marshal became, by degrees, something more ordered and less dangerous, and perhaps less alive in some of the ways that wildness makes a landscape alive. He did not mourn this entirely, but he was aware of it. What did not change was the river. The Rio Grande ran south as it had always run, fast in spring, lower in summer, unpredictable in the storms of late summer and fall, reliable in its unreliability, beautiful in the way that indifferent natural things are beautiful when you've spent enough time with them to learn their specific face. And what did not change was Georgia Slater at the stern of the flatboat, reading the current with her eyes in the way she always had and always would, with the accumulated knowledge of 20 years on this water, with the physical intelligence of someone who has made herself fluent in the language of a river, with the quiet authority of a woman who built something real in a difficult place and kept it, and shared it with someone who understood what it was worth. On a September evening in 1895, 12 years after the night Benjamin Reed had come down the rocky slope toward her dock on a lathered horse with blood on his collar and two Colts at his hips and desperation behind his eyes, Georgia and Benjamin sat on the porch of the house behind the dock and watched the last light go off the river. The children were inside. Thomas was reading. Clara and Rose were engaged in some project that involved considerable whispered conference and would probably result in a request they hadn't yet figured out how to frame. Me was in the kitchen, which was fragrant with whatever she had been doing in there all afternoon. The river was the color of hammered copper in the last of the light. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" Georgia said. "Tell me," he said. "That night," she said, "the crossing in the dark, I was thinking about reading the current without the lantern. I haven't thought about it specifically in a long time. I was on the boat this morning and something in the water reminded me the way it was running over the shallows." "What made you think about it specifically?" She was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking that I wasn't afraid," she said. "That night, I was careful and I was fully concentrated, but I wasn't afraid. And I've been trying to understand why, given that 12 men with rifles were standing on the bank and I was crossing a fast river in the dark with a man I'd known for 40 minutes. "Why?" he said. "Because I knew I could do it," she said simply. "I knew the river, I knew the crossing. Whatever else was uncertain that night, and almost everything was uncertain that was not." Benjamin looked at her in the last of the evening light. 12 years, 3 children. A crossing that had grown from a one-boat operation to the established ferry business that was now recognized in 2 countries. A life built from the materials of a very dark night on a river, navigated by a woman who knew the current. "Georgia," he said. "Benjamin," she said. "Thank you," he said, "for that night, for all the nights after it." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, a gesture that was comfortable and familiar and had not lost any of its warmth for being familiar. "Thank you," she said, "for coming back when things weren't driven by emergency." "I'll always come back," he said. "I know," she said. And she did know, had known it in the specific and settled way that you know the things that have been proven true enough times to become simply the shape of the world. The river, the crossing, the porch, Benjamin Reed beside her on it, with the border country going dark around them and the stars beginning to appear above the Rio Grande. Clara called from inside the house that supper was ready, and Rose called immediately after her in the particular harmonic of twins who have been saying the same thing at the same time for 7 years. And Thomas said something patient, an older sibling, in response, and me called everyone to the table. Georgia stood up from the porch chair and put her hand out, and Benjamin took it, and they went inside together. The lamp was burning on the kitchen table. The children were already seated. The river ran past outside in the dark, south toward Mexico, carrying the particular secrets and commerce of the border country in its current as it had always done. The crossing at Cypress Bend would be there in the morning, the dock and the flatboat and the long steering oar, and the buried posts on both banks where the mooring ropes were tied. And Georgia Slater Reed would be at the stern in the morning, reading the water with her eyes, as she had been on the night. A gunslinger came down to her dock needing one ally at the border, and found something considerably larger than an ally waiting for him in the dark.